The moment I stepped outside and saw my neighbor's rose garden blooming like it was professionally misted by rainforest fairies, while my own grass looked like it had just crawled through the Sahara begging for mercy, I knew something was wrong. Not suspicious. Not odd. Flat out wrong. I live in a suburb where every inch of green space is a personal trophy, a symbol of control and status. So when my lawn, managed by a state-of-the-art irrigation system I designed myself, began to wither while Karen's yard, yes, that Karen, the HOA president with a god complex, looked like the cover of a landscaping magazine, alarm bells weren't just ringing. They were screaming in Morse code. And the punchline? My water bill had nearly doubled, and I live alone. No kids. No hot tub. No backyard slip and slide parties. So unless my garden hose had developed a drinking problem, someone was stealing my water. I just didn't realize the thief would be the same woman who once fined me for leaving my garbage bin out 20 minutes past pickup. At first, I did the logical thing, checked for leak. Maybe a burst underground pipe? No luck. I pulled up my irrigation controller logs. Everything ran as scheduled, twice a week, 4:30-minute. Yet the soil moisture sensors reported excessive drainage. That's when I started suspecting foul play. Then again, this is the same neighborhood where one guy tried to patent his lawn stripe pattern, so paranoia is basically part of the HOA agreement. Still, it didn't sit right. So I set up a simple camera near the control box and waited. Nothing happened for 3 days. Then came the footage that changed everything. There she was, Karen. In full early morning stealth mode, if you can call wearing a neon pink tracksuit stealth. She strutted across the side boundary like she owned it, fiddled with the hose connection valve, and attached what looked like a splitter and a camouflaged hose that ran under her side fence. Then she actually turned toward the camera, smiled, waved, and walked away like she'd just won a raffle. She didn't even try to hide it. She was stealing my sprinkler water to feed her precious rose garden, bold as brass, like she was entitled to it. Now let's be clear. Karen isn't just a neighbor. She's the neighbor. The type who runs the HOA with the enthusiasm of a medieval tyrant enforcing a scroll of lawn commandments. She once fined a Vietnam vet $300 for installing a flagpole that was 1 inch too high. She sent me a violation notice for using unapproved mulch. And now, she was siphoning off my water to keep her imported Floribunda roses happy while mine withered into compost. I considered confronting her directly. But then I remembered the time my friend Ray called her out for trespassing on his lot to measure fence height, and ended up with 3 months of random inspections and a $500 fine for decorative wind chimes. No. Karen was a queen in her little fiefdom, and walking into her courtroom with a complaint only made her stronger. But I'm not just any neighbor. I'm an irrigation engineer with a knack for creative problem solving. If she wanted water, I'd give her water. Just not the kind she'd expect. I started working on what I later called Operation Vinegar Rain. First step: reroute the secondary hose line through a hidden valve system one I could activate remotely. Next, I mixed up a solution of high-concentration cleaning vinegar and a harmless, but very dramatic, purple landscaping dye. Both were non-toxic and completely safe for pipes, but lethal to delicate plants like, say, roses. I ran a few tests to make sure it wouldn't damage my own system, and then programmed the valve to switch sources at 6:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before Karen usually activated her tap on my side. But revenge is best served colorful. So I added a kicker. A tiny bit of sulfur-based scent enhancer, the kind they use to make natural gas detectable. Just a hint. Enough to make the water smell suspiciously off. So that when Karen's fancy garden party kicked off the next morning, her guests wouldn't just see her flowers turn into a scene from Willy Wonka, they'd smell something fishy too. The next morning, I didn't even need the camera. I heard the shriek from my kitchen. A loud, echoing scream followed by high-pitched gasps and the unmistakable sound of chaos. I stepped outside, casually holding my coffee, and saw Karen flailing at her garden hose like it had come alive and betrayed her. Her beautiful white roses were stained with streaks of deep purple, and her marble pathway looked like a bottle of wine had exploded across it. Her guests, half of whom were HOA members, stood in stunned silence. Some were already filming on their phones. One of them, bless their soul, muttered, "This is the best meeting we've ever had." Karen spotted me and marched over, her shoes squishing from the soggy mess behind her. "What did you do?" she screeched, waving a purple-splotched glove in my face. I raised an eyebrow and sipped my coffee. "What did I do?" I said calmly. "Looks like you've got a plumbing issue. Might want to check for backflow contamination. Very common when people illegally tap into someone else's irrigation system." She froze, then narrowed her eyes. "I'll have you reported. This is a violation of community standards." "Oh, I'm counting on it," I replied, then walked back inside as she screamed my name like a Marvel villain swearing vengeance. She thought that was the end of it, but I was just getting started. Karen must have thought I'd back down after her dramatic meltdown. Maybe she figured I'd be intimidated by the HOA, or worried about some kind of retaliation. But if her shrieking in front of her guests had been the crescendo of a symphony, then what came next was the encore. Because she didn't just stomp away with purple-stained gloves. No, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA the very next day, accusing me of malicious sabotage and unauthorized water contamination. Her language was so theatrical, I half expected her to demand that I be burned at the stake with a fire fueled by non-compliant patio furniture. The HOA board received her complaint with the same level of seriousness they give everything Karen sends them, meaning it went directly into an email folder they only open when bored. But to maintain appearances, they scheduled a review meeting. I showed up, coffee in hand, laptop loaded with time-stamped footage of her attaching the hose to my system. As soon as I played the clip, one of the board members let out a low whistle and muttered, "Well damn, Karen." That was Dave, a retired firefighter who'd had just about enough of her drama for the year. Karen didn't even try to deny the footage. She pivoted immediately, claiming it was temporary access during a community-wide drought response, and that I had verbally approved it. I asked when and where this alleged approval occurred, and she said it was at last month's potluck. I reminded her that I didn't attend that potluck because she banned me from it after I brought chili with beans, which she deemed untraditional and divisive. The room went quiet for a long moment. Dave chuckled. Karen turned beet red. Still, the board couldn't officially reprimand her without more substantial evidence of intent to damage, which was fine by me. I wasn't there to get her fined. I was there to let her know, plainly and publicly, that I wasn't the guy she could mess with. But that's the thing about entitled people like Karen. They don't learn. They escalate. 2 days later, I walked outside and noticed something odd. The hose connection I'd disabled and sealed with a lock had been tampered with. The lock was gone, replaced with a newer, shadier-looking connector that had been disguised with gravel and mulch. She'd done it again. This time with more effort to cover her tracks. That would have been annoying if it weren't so hilariously dumb. Because while Karen was busy playing Irrigation Ninja, I'd upgraded the system with pressure sensors, flow trackers, and a water quality scanner that automatically sent me alerts when any anomaly occurred. Basically, my sprinklers had become a snitching network more reliable than half the neighborhood watch. When the system alerted me at 6:52 a.m. the next morning, I was already sipping coffee and smiling. The valve flipped to the vinegar dye mix right on schedule, and I watched live footage from my camera as Karen's garden exploded in purple geysers again. This time, she tried to shut it off midstream, but the pressure had built just enough to spray back at her like a slapstick comedy gone wrong. She staggered back, soaked from the knees down, screaming into the void. But the real masterpiece came about 10 minutes later when her landscaper arrived, took one look at the carnage, and quit on the spot. I know this because he yelled, "Nope, I'm not touching haunted plumbing," loud enough for half the cul-de-sac to hear. Then he drove off, leaving Karen drenched, furious, and increasingly unstable. She retaliated that afternoon by initiating a campaign she called Beautify with Unity. Sounds sweet, right? In practice, it meant printing flyers that encouraged resource sharing among neighbors, specifically regarding irrigation. The flyers conveniently didn't mention her previous theft, but they did include a thinly veiled dig at selfish residents who hoard water. She even had the gall to suggest that we install a community flow meter that she would personally oversee. The only thing missing was a crown and scepter. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I had some quiet fun. I programmed the system to keep delivering water to her line, but only intermittently, just enough to let her think it was working again, before shutting off at random intervals. Sometimes it sprayed for 15 seconds, other times for 5 minutes. I played with the pressure just enough to make it sputter unpredictably, especially when she was watching. Her plants started to show signs of stress: brown edges, wilting petals, confused bees. Then came the cherry on top. I'd filed a quiet complaint with the city, not about Karen's theft, but about the backflow risk she created by connecting to a private irrigation system without an anti-siphon valve. They sent an inspector within a week, and as luck would have it, I was working from home that day. The inspector knocked on my door to ask a few questions, and I walked him straight to the side yard, where Karen's rogue hose line was still attached. He followed the trail right to her property, took photos, and said, "Yeah, this'll be a fun one." Turns out the city takes backflow prevention very seriously. An improperly installed connection can contaminate not just her property's water, but potentially the entire block. When they confronted her, Karen tried to throw me under the bus again, claiming I'd invited her to connect. They didn't buy it, especially after I handed over footage, diagrams, and a printed copy of the user manual from my system showing it had anti-tamper warnings. The next HOA meeting was pure theater. Karen arrived late, wearing giant sunglasses and a scarf like she was avoiding paparazzi. The board had already seen the inspector's report, and while they couldn't fine her directly, since HOA rules didn't cover water theft, they issued a no trespassing warning against her for my property and a formal censure, which is HOA speak for, "You messed up big time, but we can't legally remove you yet." But what really shifted the tide wasn't me. It was the other residents. Turns out, Karen had been skimming for more than just my water line. She'd been charging small, maintenance fees to certain homeowners for services that were supposedly covered by regular dues. One neighbor mentioned paying $50 a month for flowerbed upkeep, only to realize nothing had been done for 6 months. Another said they'd been billed for fence repairs that were never scheduled. The HOA treasurer, who'd always seemed scared of Karen, finally started speaking up. The board quietly began investigating. I kept out of it, publicly at least. My revenge was handled. My sprinklers were back to watering my lawn. My roses, basic and proud, were blooming. And Karen? Well, she'd made a lot of noise, but all she'd really done was stain her reputation a deep, unforgettable shade of purple. Karen, unsurprisingly, didn't learn her lesson. For someone who had been publicly embarrassed, reeking of vinegar and humiliated by her own weaponized roses, she had an uncanny ability to bounce back like a boomerang full of bad decisions. While I had moved on to enjoying my revitalized lawn and the local fame of being the guy who pulled off the great purple garden heist, Karen was busy plotting something. The smug silence from her side of the fence was too long, too calculated, and frankly too Karen to trust. So I waited, biding my time and upgrading my setup like a man preparing for round 2 in a suburban spy movie. And then it happened. I got a notification from my irrigation monitor app at 2:13 a.m. Most people would ignore a sensor ping in the middle of the night, but I had trained myself to perk up like a guard dog any time it buzzed. I slipped out of bed, opened the app, and there it was. A pressure anomaly. Someone had tried to hook into the system again, and this time they'd come at it with a different angle. I pulled up the live feed from my side yard camera. Karen, or someone shaped suspiciously like a woman wearing a hoodie, house slippers, and wielding garden tools like a burglarized botanist, was crawling along the side of my fence, installing what looked like a reinforced hose line straight through a modified sprinkler head. She wasn't just tapping into the system. She was building infrastructure. I watched her attach a new coupler, cover it with decorative stones, and then tiptoe back across the property line like she hadn't just committed a full-blown irrigation felony. She had upgraded her operation, and in doing so, declared war. The next morning, I discovered her glossy new Unity through landscaping sign hanging on a shared community bulletin board. It was framed in gold leaf, printed in italics, and featured her smug face next to a quote that read, "True neighbors share more than fences. They share futures." I almost spit out my coffee. She had essentially turned water theft into a motivational poster. Of course, she had gone too far now. Her new hose line wasn't just annoying, it was risky. Without proper pressure regulation, any significant draw from my system could cause blowback into hers, or worse, a full-blown burst. So I decided to let her dream big for a moment. Then I'd make her new setup unravel like a badly tied hammock. First, I left the system active just enough to fill her hose and give her confidence. I knew she'd test it a few times before announcing her next big garden unveiling. While she basked in her self-appointed title of Community Horticulture Ambassador, I prepared my next move. I switched out the dye, this time going for a bright orange. Not soft, subtle, or floral. No, this one was the color of traffic cones and hazard signs. And instead of the acidic vinegar mix, I used a biodegradable but powerfully pungent fish emulsion fertilizer, the kind that smells like a seafood dumpster in the middle of July. Still safe, still non-toxic, but oh so effective at sending a message. I set it to trigger during her next scheduled garden demo, which I knew about thanks to her constant Facebook posts about community aesthetic alignment. She'd even sent out invitations to the entire HOA mailing list, complete with an RSVP for light refreshments and rose admiration. The woman was nothing if not dedicated to delusion. When the day came, I pretended to be out for a jog. In truth, I looped around to the side street and positioned myself with a view of her backyard. Right on cue, the system activated at 9 a.m. The guests had barely started nibbling on finger sandwiches when the first fountain of fishy orange water gushed from her centerpiece sprinkler. It sprayed in a beautiful arc across her prized roses, splattering the petals, the mulch, and even a few unlucky guests. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. One woman shrieked and clutched her pearls. A man in cargo shorts gagged and dropped his drink. A child began crying. Karen looked around in horror as the scent hit the air, thick and unmistakably foul. Then, as if on cue, the sprinkler stuttered and spat one last sputter of orange sludge that landed squarely on her lawn flamingo decor, which now looked like it had been dunked in a vat of hot sauce. Karen scrambled to shut off the flow but fumbled with the valve, twisting the wrong direction and getting a fresh burst across her arm. I watched from my covert perch, smiling behind my sunglasses as the HOA's elite retreated from her yard like it had turned into a biological hazard zone. Her event had gone from a garden showcase to a fish market disaster in 60 seconds flat. Later that day, the HOA meeting was called to order, not by Karen but by Dave, the retired firefighter who had quietly started organizing against her reign. He brought up the mysterious hose line and city violation report. Then, as if fate itself had written the script, one of the HOA members pulled out their phone and played a clip from the garden party. It had gone viral on Nextdoor. The caption read, "When your water tastes like revenge." Karen tried to shift the blame again, accusing me of sabotage. I didn't even have to defend myself. The footage spoke for itself. One member pointed out that only someone who knew her schedule could have timed the chaos so precisely, implying an inside job. Another resident leaned forward and asked the real question. Why was she tapping into someone else's system at all? That's when the dominoes started to fall. Residents who had been quietly fed up finally began to speak. Complaints poured in. Not just about water, but about unauthorized fines, bullying emails, and unexplained HOA dues increases. Turns out Karen had been running a one-woman HOA empire for too long, and the cracks had turned into craters. The meeting ended with a motion for a formal audit of HOA funds and the creation of a temporary oversight committee. Karen looked like she was trying to disappear into her floral blouse. As for me, I returned home to a lawn freshly hydrated by my now tamper-proof system. I added a few finishing touches: a decorative gnome holding a miniature water bucket, and a new motion sensor that played a sprinkler sound anytime someone got too close. Karen hadn't just lost control of the water. She'd lost control of the narrative. And in this neighborhood, that was the one thing she could never afford to let slip. Karen's defeat should have been the final act. Most people, after being publicly humiliated in front of their prized social circle, would have taken the hint, retired quietly, rebranded themselves, maybe even taken up a hobby that didn't involve violating property lines. But Karen wasn't most people. She was the kind of person who'd rather burn down her own garden than admit she'd lost control of it. And that's almost exactly what she did, though, to be fair, it was more of a flood than a fire. A week after her fishy orange garden party fiasco, the neighborhood fell into an eerie calm. Karen hadn't made a peep. No flyers. No inspections. No snide comments about paint colors or non-compliant birdhouses. It was like the queen of the cul-de-sac had gone radio silent. But for those of us who dealt with her before, we knew this wasn't surrender. It was the eye of the storm. Sure enough, late one night, my system pinged again. Not the sprinkler sensors this time. The soil monitors. Saturation levels on the boundary between my property and hers were suddenly off the charts, which could mean only one thing. Karen was messing with the water lines again. But not mine. By the time the sun rose, the damage was obvious. Her lawn was soaked. Not just damp. Drenched, as if Poseidon himself had risen up and declared her yard the new oceanfront. Water had pooled at the edges of her garden, soaked her pathway, and overflowed into the curb. Even her mailbox looked like it had been through a hurricane. I watched from my porch as she stomped around in rubber boots, yelling into her phone, waving at passing cars like this was someone else's fault. It would have been comical, if not for the fact that the excess runoff had created a channel, one that now curved directly across my driveway. I walked over with my phone in hand and asked, as casually as I could, if she was aware that she was flooding her own yard and part of mine. She looked up, bags under her eyes, hair a frazzled mess, and said she was testing an advanced subsoil moisture redistribution system. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. That wasn't just nonsense, it was high-level nonsense. It was the kind of nonsense that tried to sound smart so people wouldn't question it. But I was an irrigation engineer. She might as well have said she was installing a unicorn-powered hydration spell. I filed a report with the city's Environmental Management Office, not because I wanted more trouble, but because runoff violations in our neighborhood came with serious fines, and because I knew she wouldn't stop until someone with an official clipboard knocked on her door. That knock came 2 days later. The inspector spent all of 10 minutes in her yard before issuing her a citation and demanding that she cease all unauthorized plumbing work immediately. Karen, true to form, tried to spin it as sabotage, accusing me of tampering with her new underground drainage system. Unfortunately for her, the inspector had already seen my clean system. He also saw her tangled mess of unauthorized tubing, incorrectly spliced connectors, and an illegal backflow pump. It wasn't just an eyesore, it was a plumbing disaster waiting to happen. And it did. That night, under cover of darkness, Karen tried one last time to install a hidden water reroute. But instead of success, she ruptured one of her own PVC lines near the front walkway. The burst sent a jet of water blasting into her electrical outlet box, causing the lights on her porch to flicker, spark, and finally die out completely. I heard the chaos from my living room. A loud shout, a thud, and the unmistakable sound of water sloshing where it shouldn't. When I went outside the next morning, the entire left side of her front yard looked like it had been hit by a water balloon cannon. The brick path was cracked, half her lawn was underwater, and her luxury SUV, usually parked in her pristine driveway, had water splashed up across the entire driver's side door. She called an emergency HOA meeting. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't approved, and nobody really showed up except for her, Dave, and me. Karen launched into a 10-minute tirade, waving soggy papers and shouting about environmental sabotage, neighbor misconduct, and something about fish-based terrorism. Dave listened with his usual calm, then turned to me and asked, "You got video again?" I did. I always did. And this time it included footage of Karen, at midnight, crawling on her knees with a PVC pipe in one hand and a wrench in the other like she was part of some covert plumbing operation. Karen's voice cracked when she realized she'd been caught again. She tried to pivot, claiming emotional distress, neighborhood harassment, the whole 9 yards. Then she pulled out the nuclear card, a cease and desist letter. Handwritten. In glitter gel pen. It looked less like a legal document and more like something from a deranged scrapbook. She handed it to me with trembling fingers and declared that if I didn't stop surveilling her property, she would take me to court for psychological warfare. I folded the paper neatly, placed it back into her hand, and told her I'd be happy to see her in court, especially since her tampering had just triggered another round of city fines. She stormed off, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits, and justice through horticulture, whatever that meant. But by then, the damage was done, figuratively and literally. The HOA board, tired of the circus, finally called for an emergency vote. Karen had burned through her support, and no one wanted to be associated with the woman who nearly electrocuted herself in a puddle of her own irrigation disaster. The board voted unanimously to censure her and remove her from her role as president effective immediately. Karen didn't even show up for the vote. Her house was dark that night, shutters drawn, porch lights still out. She'd become a ghost on the block, a soggy, purple-stained reminder of what happens when entitlement meets engineering. For my part, I spent the evening adjusting my sprinkler system for spring bloom, sipping a cold drink on my porch while my dog rolled happily in the freshly watered lawn. I even planted a new flower bed near the fence line. It wasn't petty. It was just practical. After all, every garden needs a little border, and a reminder that some lines should never be crossed. Spring rolled in with the kind of peaceful breeze that made you think the chaos of the past few weeks had been nothing but a fever dream. The neighborhood was quiet, content, and for the first time in what felt like forever, nobody was receiving arbitrary fines for imaginary violations like inconsistent hedge aesthetics or overly enthusiastic porch lights. Karen's absence from HOA leadership had an almost magical effect on the community. People started chatting again during their evening walks, kids played longer in the cul-de-sac, and no one was nervously eyeing their mailbox for passive-aggressive newsletters. It was almost suspicious how calm things had become. That is, until Karen made one last appearance. She'd been holed up for days, not a single sighting except for the occasional movement behind the blinds. Some thought she was gone, fled to another HOA to start fresh with new victims. But no, she was still there, brooding in silence like a cartoon villain rethinking her master plan. And just when we thought we were free, a final envelope appeared in everyone's mailbox, hand-delivered, unmarked, and sealed with tape. It was a letter from Karen, typed in a disturbingly formal font and filled with the sort of language that made you feel like you were being sued just by reading it. She called it a farewell address, but it read more like a threat disguised as a poem. She blamed her removal on misinformation, betrayal, and neighborly insubordination. She accused unnamed individuals, clearly me, of waging psychological warfare with artificially enhanced liquids and claimed that she had been a visionary misunderstood by those she tried to beautify. She ended the letter by announcing that she was selling her house, and would be moving to a more deserving neighborhood where appreciation for roses still exists. I laughed out loud when I read that. So did half the block. When the moving truck finally pulled up, it was like watching a storm cloud pack its bags and leave. A few neighbors gathered discreetly, peeking from behind curtains, sipping coffee, enjoying the moment as her carefully manicured garden furniture was loaded into the truck one awkward piece at a time. I spotted the infamous purple-stained hose among the items, still looped up, still marked with ghostly streaks of dye. She glared at anyone who dared to look her way, a last scowl of defeat before disappearing into the cab of the truck and vanishing down the street for good. The HOA wasted no time in transforming itself. Dave was officially elected president, and within a week the board passed a new rule, unanimously and enthusiastically, banning any unauthorized access to personal irrigation systems, with fines so high it could fund a small dam. The community threw a small get-together to celebrate, potluck style, with an open mic and a chili contest that I, despite Karen's past scorn, proudly entered and won. My prize? A gnome trophy holding a tiny watering can. But the best part came a few days later. A local paper ran a story about neighborhood disputes and highlighted ours as a case study. They didn't name names, but the details were obvious. The headline read, "When HOA power trips get wet and wild." The article featured anonymous quotes, but one clearly came from Dave. "Sometimes you've got to fight fire with fertilizer. Or in this case, vinegar." My favorite line, though, came from one of Karen's ex-friends. She started with roses and ended with sewage. It was poetic in a petty, satisfying way. With the drama behind us, I went back to focusing on my garden. Not just the maintenance but the growth. I planted new wildflowers along the edge of my yard, not only for aesthetics but for the bees, butterflies, and symbolism. They stood right along the line where Karen's stolen hose had once run. My irrigation system ran smoother than ever, fully secured with new encrypted valves and motion detection. I even installed a small screen inside my garage that displayed soil moisture and pressure stats like I was running NASA's garden division. One morning, while I was adjusting the spray angles for the summer settings, I found a small package on my porch. No name, no return address, just a plain cardboard box with a single note inside. The note said, "Loved the vinegar trick. Let's collaborate next time." Signed, a fellow HOA survivor. Inside the box was a tiny plastic flamingo painted purple and orange. I stared at it, both amused and intrigued. Whoever sent it clearly understood the art of neighborhood warfare. Part of me wanted to know who it was. The other part loved the mystery. A few days later, a new family moved into Karen's old house. Young couple, friendly, two energetic dogs, and not a clipboard in sight. We welcomed them with cupcakes and lemonade, and when they asked about the weird stain near the rose bed, I just smiled and said, "That's part of the neighborhood legend. You'll learn soon enough." They laughed. We laughed. The dogs tried to dig it up. It felt like a fresh start. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sprinklers arc across my lawn in perfect unison. No drama, no sabotage, just peace and pressurized hydration. The moon rose slowly, casting a silver sheen across the wet grass. Somewhere down the street, a kid's laughter echoed. For the first time in a long while, everything felt balanced. And just as I was about to head inside, the motion sensor by the side fence chirped once, then went quiet. I looked at the screen inside. Nothing alarming. Probably a rabbit or a breeze. But still, I glanced toward the fence with a smirk. Just in case. Because if there's one thing this whole saga taught me, it's that every garden needs sunlight, water, and a bit of vigilance. Not just for weeds, but for Karen's. And now, mine had all three.